you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, we've got many crises happening around the world. We have a crisis in the Middle East. We have financial crises. And I'm 46 this year, and I think there's been ongoing wars ever since I can remember. But there's also a war happening between the ears. And I'd love to explore what's happening in the mind and what's causing so many mental illnesses.
Well, I appreciate that. That's what I do for a living, and I've been doing it for a long time. Um, I view most all mental illnesses as a biological basis to it. There are certain situations that happen in life where we have a crisis, and it may not be all biological, but the type of stuff that I treat is more chronic and enduring: depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, OCD, and other things like that. Those have a real biological basis to them. And so my whole career has been focused on learning the best ways to treat those things. So the reason I'm on here is because I'm plugging my book, Why Me, the Brain on Tilt. It's sort of a accumulation of 35 years of practice, as well as really a good foundation of training. I felt like some of my knowledge was going to go away when I retired or when I passed away, and I wanted to leave a legacy. I wanted to leave information that was useful to people, not a textbook, not just raw facts and figures, not a pamphlet. I wanted it to have stories that people could resonate with, but also be evidence-based as a basis. Everything in the book is all based on scientific evidence that we know. It has lots of citations. None of it's my opinion, and none of it's my belief system. It's really pure science and pure experience. And every word in there has to ring true with me because I've been down that path with a lot of people. So the book resonates with people who struggle with mental illness. That's one of the key things I wanted to do, is resonate. I want the words to matter and the experiences to be relatable. So that's kind of how I did it. And basically, I'm expressing what patients experience in the book.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the general notion about the book. But mental illness in general, I want people to understand that it's common. And in my book, I mentioned statistically, 50% of people will have at least one mental health crisis episode in their lifetime. That's 1 in 2. So it's very, very common. Now, the chronic, more severe mental illnesses may not be quite that common, but there's still 20% of the population struggle with chronic issues with depression or schizophrenia or bipolar. So that's still 1 in 5. And so whether we have it or our brothers or sisters or parents or other relatives have it, we're going to come across it. We're going to be involved with it in some way. And the more we have an understanding, the better. It helps us
Mhm.
understand it better, be less judgmental, and not use words that might shame somebody so that they don't get any help, which further stigmatizes mental illness. We do those types of things.
Mhm. The shame component of it, I think people are afraid to ask for help because they think asking for help is a sign of weakness. But what I've learned over the years is that it's only the strong people who ask for help. So when people ask for help, that's actually a sign of strength. And I think as a community, we should encourage people to ask for help because if your tire's flat on the car, you ask for help. If you've got a leaky roof, you ask for help. If you need money, you go to the bank and you ask for help. There's no stigma at all. And I think
No,
we
that's
should, as a society, encourage people, you know,
no,
do
I
it. It's
agree
the right
with you.
thing.
In my book, I make an analogy to like diabetes or whatever. Someone
Mm,
has diabetes and they go get help for it. Should they be shamed or should they be judged? No, no one
mm,
does that because they recognize it as a medical condition. It's not their fault. It's not a weakness. But the brain is no different. It's just a more complex organ than the pancreas is. It's far more
mm,
complex. And we think it's somehow shielded from disease and from suffering. No, not at all. In fact, it's more prone. It's highly complex, so it's prone to disease and illness. And so if someone struggles with a mental illness, it's really a brain illness. So why should they be ashamed of it? It's not in their control. And so
mm.
we want to send the message that it's just another organ illness, except the brain is so powerful and it affects our behavior and what we say. So that's why it's confusing to people sometimes. Like, you should be able to control that with your thoughts. And that's like saying you should be able to control your diabetes with your thoughts or with doing something different. And it's not really the case. So once we understand the biological nature of these things, we're less judgmental, and we use better words than "Well, just do this," or "Just get it over it," or if you just exercise more, you're gonna be fine. So those
What
are the
about
types of
that?
things that people they
What about
get
that really
told.
good advice? Just toughen up. Just be a
Yeah.
man. Put your big girl pants on. Is it that must be such wonderful advice. So
Well, in the
helpful for
US,
people.
it's pull yourself up by the bootstraps is kind of the thing, just buck up, pull yourself up, you'll get over it, and that does more harm than good. And the reason it does
Mhm.
more harm than good is because when you tell somebody that who's really struggling, what's the likelihood they're gonna go get help? Probably pretty low, because 'cause they've already felt like it's their fault or they're doing something wrong or they're ashamed of it. But if you say, "It's not your fault, and,
Mm.
it's just another brain disorder, just like everything else, I completely support you going to get help," that person's more likely to get help. And I've said over and over again when I do these podcasts that words matter. Um, I have some examples in my own family where words matter. One of my close relatives developed a pretty severe mental illness, and I had another one felt the same one. And the one got help, treatment, been in treatment ever since, has 2 kids, doing really, really well. The other one had friends in his peer group who said, "You don't have that. I don't believe that." And they turned him off from treatment, and that relative is no longer with us. And so those simple little words, which may have been well-meaning, had a terrible outcome. So I'm really caution people about what they tell people, what they say, because words
Mm.
matter. They do
Mm.
matter.
Mm. Wild. Going back to stigma, is there historical reasons why there's so much shame and stigma around it? The first thing that comes to my mind is these people who have been told that they're witches and they've been burned at the stake or they've been drowned in the river. How far does it go back and where did these stigmas come from?
Well, you're right. We go back into the dark ages and we have all kinds of notions and beliefs about what these things mean. You're full of the devil and the demon, and you did something wrong, and we just have to exercise, do an exorcism and get it out. That just sends a message that you must have done something wrong to get this evil upon yourself. And so
Mm.
there's all kinds of things. And in my early training, I moonlighted at a state hospital that had been built before the turn of the century, so it was well over 100 years old. And pre-medication, we didn't really have great options for treating serious mental illness. And so at this state hospital, they had these underground hallways or tunnels actually under the ground that connected the buildings. And they had different buildings, different parts of the hospital. And when I used to moonlight there on the weekends, so I'd have to go down in those tunnels to get to the other buildings. It was dark down there. And if you look to the side, you would start to see where they had chains on the wall. And this is where they kept people that were sick chained to the wall with no recourse but to yell and scream endlessly in a dark space. And then if you went up to one of the third floors of one of the buildings, they had a little museum up there, and they had they had these bathtubs, but they used them as ice treatment, ice water treatment. They would stick humans in there to try to use ice water to get rid of this mental illness. So we've had all kinds of barbaric ways of trying to treat this, and then the witch hunts and burning people at the stake. Who knows if some of those people weren't mentally ill? And so we go way back on how and the stigma, I think, has evolved into that. So, we're in the modern age. We have modern science. We can start to think of this differently, and that's what I'm trying to do is think of it differently.
Mm. I lived and worked in the Middle East for many years, and one of the roles that I held was in peer support and critical incident stress management. And if there was a crisis and somebody mentioned that they were feeling stressed, and then the word suicide came up, it was our job to be able to get them the right support and to get out of the country within about 24 hours. Because if they heard that word on the telephone and the telephones were being tapped, there was a chance that they were put into a particular hospital. And there was always rumors that they were still doing lobotomies in this part of the world. It was whispered. I can't prove that it was happening, but we still had instructions to get them out within 24 hours. And so even at that stage, we're only talking 2007 to 2012, people mentioning that they had a mental illness was frightening for them because it was almost punishable by law. And so they wouldn't talk about it. But the
Yeah, what
suicide rates followed. People would jump out of the buildings, people would commit suicide in other countries once they were out, but they didn't get help.
Well, you get into those situations where there's a lot of ignorance about mental illness and belief systems around it. That really makes it highly stigmatized and highly shameful. So sometimes the only recourse is to take your life because there's nobody there supporting you get any kind of help. And if you're already suicidal, you're already at that place where you're hopeless and you don't see any other options. So to yeah, you need the right help and the right support for sure. But again, it varies around the country, around the world on what the understanding is, what the stigma level is, the shaming level, and beliefs can also really cause problems because it doesn't really take into account the brain and how it really works.
Mm, mm. For me personally, I had a bit of a transition, a turning point in my life around about 2007. And I ended a business, I started a couple of careers. I tried to go to university, that didn't work. And I kind of got into that pit of despair. And things started to get pretty dark. It was like, with everything that I've done and achieved in my life so far, this is only as far as I can get. And I felt like I was down in that pit and there was no way out. And the bargaining came in. It was like the praying to the gods, the begging of the gods. If you get me out of this pit of despair and help me get my life back on track, then I'm going to do all these wonderful things. And it was dark because I looked around at family and friends and everybody else was doing so well. And then I started to feel guilty. I felt guilty for the talents and skills that I had that I wasn't able to use at that time. And it was a lot of self shaming. Nobody else was shaming me, but myself. And then the comparisons were coming in. And it was a tough time because I thought, do I want to burden my friends with this? Because what's the advice? Are they going to give me good advice or not? Are they going to give me advice that is going to make it worse? Do I tell my parents and do I make them worry about me? And I remember that I was in a pit of despair and it lasted a long time and it was uncomfortable and you feel isolated.
Well, you got to
It's a bit alone.
experience what a lot of people do experience, that
Mm,
50% I talk about. Some of those 50% are the 20% who have it all the time for decades. So you start to have a little inkling of what that could be like if it was long term and what people
mm,
must actually go through. Yeah, in my book, I talk about this delay in treatment. The average length of the delay for people to get into treatment when they start having symptoms is around 6 to 8 years. So they suffer in silence for a long time before they actually get help. So I can imagine what that's like. And then research sort of supports the idea that early intervention is better than later intervention, right? The brain's not as settled in, it's a little more amenable to treatment. So another reason I put a book out there to the general public is awareness of you start having problems, don't wait around, get past the shame, get past the guilt, get past all that stuff. Just get help, take care of yourself. And you have to kind of sometimes make yourself number one when it comes to this sort of thing, because some people around you may not be supportive. They may not say the right things, but you need to go straight in and get help for yourself because that's all that really matters at the end of the day. In your case, at the end of the day, you getting some kind of help or some kind of direction or some kind of something was the most important thing. You might have
mm,
had this advice or this comment or this and that, which could have been either helpful or not helpful. And
mm,
so the book is for an individual to pick up and read this book and say, treatment does work. There is hope. I don't have to wait for someone's permission to go get help. And so
mm.
that's kind of one of the take home messages here is a lot of people struggle in silence and it takes them a long time to get in and it makes it a little bit harder to treat. In the meantime, they could die. They could end up taking their life if they wait too long. So these things, this is a dangerous condition to be in, if that makes sense.
I just wrote down here 6 to 8 years before they get into treatment. If I had a broken arm, I wouldn't wait 6 or 7 minutes to go to the hospital. I'd be there immediately.
Right.
If I was bleeding out, I'd be there immediately. If I had a coleslaw, if I had a coleslaw, if I had a sty in my eye, I'd be immediately at the doctor that day. You know, I'm just thinking all these physical things, external things, we would never delay for 6 to 8 years. We would be down seeking help and would have no shame at all. But 6 to 8 years, the pain that we must go through and how much it amplifies and magnifies the situation for that 20% of people, it must be a wild world for them. What happens to them during that 6 to 8 period? You know, where do they start? What do they go through? Where do they end up before they make that decision to seek help?
Yeah, that's a good point, because the longer it goes untreated, we call it a downward spiral. Something's bound to happen bad when you have something like this going on that affects you in every way. It affects your motivation, your desire, your energy level, your sleep. It affects your relationships, your productivity, and your economic abilities. Everything is affected, and also it leads to some addiction, or alcohol and other drugs, because they're looking for something to get them happy and to get this fix. And that's, of itself is a problem, and contributes to that downward spiral. Every time I get a new patient, I've got a new diagnosis for mental illness of some sort, I have a serious talk and I say, we're at a fork in the road right now. You can either go with what I recommend and your outcome's going to be a lot better, or you can not take my advice or anybody else's advice and you go downward. And it's pretty dramatic fork. And so I just try to be super transparent. I try to be honest. And I say the insight is the most important thing you can have right now. You may not believe everything that comes out of my mouth. It may be kind of hard to believe, but you're just going to have to trust that I'm going to guide you in the right direction so that you don't have a bad outcome. And so, and everybody who does take that advice, their outcomes are so much better. But I run into some people who have zero insight, and it's like they're full of crap, and I'm not going to take your advice. What do you know? And I can predict what's going to happen. So these are serious things. And again, it's awareness, it's the ability to get past the shame. And I have to educate the people around them so that they don't say the wrong things. And all they are is loving and supporting and encouraging. And that's hard because they don't teach that stuff in school. Our parents don't typically teach it. So we have to kind of be the next generation that changes that dynamic somehow and care about the next person next to them. We live in a society of selfishness and greed and power, and we have this division among people politically and all kinds of things. It's okay to have differences of opinion. It's okay to have different views, but how we talk about those views with each other matters. Because sometimes you hear something from the other side that makes you think a different way, and vice versa. So I always feel it's good to have a dialogue among people, but when you stop having a dialogue, that's a problem.
You mentioned addiction. And in my mind, when I hear addiction, a couple of things that come to mind is things like alcohol, drugs, tobacco. That's kind of how I think addiction was framed when I was growing up. But it's not the only type of addiction or type of fixation. What are the other addictions that might not be as obvious as picking up a bottle, smoking a cigarette, or injecting yourself with some substance? What are the other addictions that
Well,
people
there's
have?
of course gambling. People can get very addicted to gambling, and it's another form of addiction. There's sexual addiction too, where people, um, heavily addicted to pornography. And it's not casual; it's more heavy. So those are other types of addictions. Anything that is like a dopamine rush in the brain is an addiction. So it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, stuff that brings someone high, but it's also detrimental to them in the long run. It's not providing any usefulness to them. and it's also damaging relationships, damaging their job, damaging everything in their life. It's a dead end. But that dopamine is so strong and powerful in the brain. And so, and also if you have mental illness overlapping it, their level of control is not good. So job one is to get the mental illness under control and work on the addiction. It's a two-pronged effort in those situations. So it takes some steps along the way. There's no magic wand, but getting the mental illness controlled has to happen. Otherwise, addiction will never come under control because they don't have the control, the ability to put brakes in.
With the dopamine, can you explain that in simple terms for somebody who's at high school to understand what dopamine is and how it impacts the brain and the body?
Well, the brain has they're what we call neurotransmitters, and they're really just chemicals that go between um, what we call synapses, the little gaps between the cell body and the next cell body at the end of what they call a dendrite. So they're just simple little blocks that are there. What they do represent is that different parts of the brain have more of an emphasis of, say, dopamine versus serotonin versus norepinephrine versus GABA. There's a lot of neurotransmitters. And over time, science has learned that these have different roles. Now, dopamine is also important in schizophrenia and in psychotic disorders, but it also plays a role in addiction. So we have drugs that sort of target those systems and help us control them better. Not perfectly, but better. You hear about serotonin related to depression, but also so is norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters. More and more, we're also talking about brain circuits, and that's really become a thing in the last 5-10 years where we're starting to dissect the brain, and it has these pathways that are like circuits. And so, like, I use TMS, which is brain stimulation technique, where you use it's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and you target certain regions of the surface of the brain that are part of a circuit in a deeper part of the brain, like especially the limbic system. So we know that stimulating certain areas can make depression go away or improve OCD. So now we're starting to learn it's not just neurochemistry, but it's also certain brain areas that are more prone to certain things. Like the limbic system is super powerful. It's our emotion center, and all mammals have a limbic system. That's why we have such a kinship to mammals. It doesn't matter what the mammal is, a dog, cat, a rat, a monkey. They all have that emotional range that we have. And that's why they're perceptive of our emotions and we're often perceptive of theirs. But reptiles and amphibians do not have a limbic system. That's why we don't have any kinship with them. We may have some kind of relationship, but it's not an emotional one. And so
I don't want to pet the snake. I want to pet
you can pet the snake, but
retriever.
it's not going to be the same reaction that you want. Okay. So if it gives you a hug, it's a different kind of hug. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a people pleaser like my golden retriever.
Place. So we know a lot about brain science and brain anatomy and how things work, and evolution is super important because mammals and humans, we're all mammals basically. We're just a different kind of mammal, but our brains evolved together. So there's not a huge, like between chimpanzees and us, we're like 99 or 98% the same. You got, well, what's the difference? Because there's a lot of differences in our communication and some of the things we do. They also have their own intelligence. It's just different than ours. But in terms of emotion, that's where there's very little difference. Like even dolphins and whales, they're mammals as well. Even though they look like fish, they're not. They have communication systems, language. They have pods of families and kinship and extended family, just like we do. And so a lot of the neuroscience is focused on understanding that. And so the medications can affect some of these neurotransmitter systems, and dopamine's been associated with addiction, but also associated with schizophrenia. So in a very small region of the brain, it's associated with Parkinson's disease as well. And so that's what we target when we try to treat Parkinson's. So science is still marching along. We still got a lot to learn.
You mentioned dolphins and emotions. Somebody will have to fact check me on this one, but I believe that I once read that Dolphins can experience depression, and they're also a mammal that can commit suicide by choosing to swim under the water, staying under the water, and refusing to breathe and ending their own life. And I'd love somebody to fact check me on that, because I'm pretty sure I've read that in the past. And it's interesting that all of us have different feelings. And one thing that's sweeping through the Australian community at the moment for blue and white collar people are what they call the three Bs: bags, bongs, and beers. So people are snorting a lot of cocaine. They're smoking a lot of marijuana through the bong, and they're also drinking a lot of beers. And what I've heard is that people who are doing cocaine, they get a spike in dopamine, but it also depletes that dopamine long term. Is that a truth of what happens with cocaine and
I
dopamine?
believe it is a truth, because you become habituated to something after a while, so the effect wears down, so you gotta use more and more. So something's happening in the brain where, we have to use more to get the same effect. So, they want stronger and more frequent, and it's a vicious cycle. On the dolphin side of things, I think probably what you said is probably more likely to be true than not. Um, we know that when we put dolphins into captivity, or we remove their mate, or remove their child, essentially, we separate them from their family. They go into this reclusive, depressed state where they're just not doing anything, and you can just tell they're moping around. So they have the same emotions as we do, and we sort of think there's some kind of robot or something, but no, they're just
Mm.
have a mammalian brain. They're highly intelligent, highly, highly intelligent. That's why the militaries use them to help them locate mines and work for them, essentially. So, as I've gotten older, I just really do not like to see whales and dolphins in captivity and just used for exploitation, essentially, because they have feelings too. It's like capturing a bunch of humans and putting them in a cage, and we go there to watch them perform, and they can't leave. That
Mm.
would be human exploitation. So once you realize that they're not far away from us, and that, we start to think differently about how that all
Mm.
works.
Mm. We were talking offline before, and the words "I'm not alone" came up, and my wife and I were talking about this last night. That I wrote a book many years ago, self-published, and I called it "You Are Not Alone: 99 Problems," and I listed out all of these fears, doubts, and limiting beliefs that I have, that my clients have, and I put them in a book so other people could read the book and say, "Okay, I'm not alone." But what we're talking about goes beyond that, even coming to depression and mental health disorders. 50% of people are going to experience it at least once throughout their life. 20% of people are going to have it long term, maybe a decade or more.
Their whole
So
life,
it's
basically their whole
the
life.
whole life.
Yeah, their whole
Have you
life.
heard of
It doesn't go away. It can be treated and stabilized, but 20% of people will have chronic mental illness of some sort.
Dr.
That's
Jordan
high.
Peterson?
That's 1 in
Yeah,
5 people. So it's a lot of people, you just don't know it.
yeah, yeah. Could be somebody in the house right now.
Exactly.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, he was mentioning that he had depression for many years. And he was saying that for him, it was like waking up every morning and feeling like you've got hit by a freight train, and the dread and the doom of losing your entire family unit. And he said for him, that's how he was waking up every single day for years. That's one example. What are other examples? Because I'm sure all of us experience it differently. And so, because we're not dialoguing about it, we don't know that other people are feeling the same way. What are some of those common examples that you've written about in your book? How people experience different mental disorders?
Well, I talk about 5 or 6 or 7 in my book. I highlight all the ones that I see 99% of the time in my practice, the things that are really important. major depression or depression, clinical depression, that's all the same thing. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression, but it's bipolar. There's a subtype of that called schizoaffective disorder. It's not schizophrenia, but it can have some psychosis or psychotic element to it, but it still has the bipolar mood swings typically. There's schizophrenia. There's obsessive compulsive disorder. That's different than someone who has an obsessive compulsive personality. They're different.
Okay. What's the
Um,
difference?
the difference is personality disorders are kind of persistent, but I'm kind of obsessive compulsive personality, so I get a lot of things done. And I just get things done. If you put me to task, I'll get it done. If I would go to work at the hospital, I'm going to work hard during the time I'm there. But I'm very productive, highly productive. I've accomplished a lot. Obsessive compulsive disorder has irrational, what we call intrusive thoughts. They're completely irrational thoughts, and the patient knows it. It could be, oh, you're a really bad person. You're a really bad person. And even if you're feeling good, or it could be, watch those germs on the handle on the door and make sure you wash your hands 20 or 30 times after you touch it. Those thoughts about germ phobia, completely irrational. I mean, yeah, there's germs, of course, but the average person, doesn't wash their hands 30 or 40 times a day either. It can be all kinds of intrusive thoughts. Those are just a few examples.
And
And
was
it's
that
not
OCD or
That's
O
OCD. That's not the personality. It's obsessive compulsive disorder. So the
disorder?
disorder is different than the personality. And
Okay.
disorders usually are non-productive. In this case, it's highly non-productive because if you're spending, an hour a day just washing your hands, that's interrupting your productive day. But people with a severe OCD, they can go 4, 5, 6 hours just sitting in their thoughts because they just go around and around and around. So the key difference between those two is one's productive and the other one's completely non-productive.
Mm.
But the
Before we
OCD
move,
part is also treatable with meds, and the other one is
mm,
not.
mm. Before we move on that point, there's a young man who lives in our area, and he eats at the same restaurant. And I watch him come in, and he will walk in the door, but he won't touch the door handle. He'll locate his seat, he'll put on his gloves, and he'll sanitize all the area. He'll do the table, he'll do the chairs. He'll go into the bathroom, he'll wash his hands, he'll change his gloves, he'll come back out, and then he'll pick up the public sauce bottle, but he'll have to put his
I
glove back on.
almost guarantee he's got OCD.
Yep. And I watch his routine.
That's a good example.
Yep. I watch his routine, and you can see how fixated he is on it. And his routine is not random. It's been perfected. And it's the same routine over and over and again. And he's doing a good job at keeping it clean. He's doing a really good job. He doesn't miss a spot, but you can see that it creates a stress for him because if he has missed a spot, he's got to come back and start again. So that would be.
And how much time is that taking him to do things that are really unimportant? How much time does that take him?
It's got to be a 15-minute routine minimum, and I feel exhausted watching him.
And you're only catching a snapshot of his day. You're not seeing what he's like at home or anywhere else. You just see him in that one spot doing that. Think of the rest of his day. If that's his day, so how productive is that? It's not productive. And so that's OCD, and that is treatable with meds. It is considered a brain disorder, treatable with meds and other treatment, and TMS also treats it as well. And we can make huge difference with biological intervention for a guy like that. But my book talks about those differences and how they present themselves, and it gives an example of someone who's actually going through that disorder from before they got treatment, during treatment, and after treatment, and kind of what it looks like. And it also gives examples of types of OCD and types of obsession. So when I first put my book out, a social worker I work with at a hospital said, I related to chapter 7, that OCD one. That's me. It's like, that's what I'm going for here. I want you to be able to resonate with this and say it's okay to get treatment and get it treated. So those are the types of things that are in the book.
You also mentioned OCD, and then there was one that sounded very similar. And you said that for yourself, you're very productive. What did you call that one?
obsessive compulsive personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality, not disorder, but obsessive compulsive personality. People that are high achievers and things like that, they may fall into that category. It's productive, though. You can get a lot done. You don't waste any time, but you can be hard to be around a little bit because you get a little rigid. You're doing this. Well, don't interrupt my routine here. I got to get this stuff done. So it's not a great thing all the time, but it depends on what profession you're in and what you do. I have a pretty high volume profession, and I see a lot of people and go a lot of places, and I'm raised a pretty large family, so I've got to be pretty productive to make it work. So I've become kind of obsessive compulsive personality style. But that's different than the disorder like the guy you saw. That guy is not productive. He's spinning his wheels, doing things that he doesn't really need to do, and you're just getting a snapshot of his day. It could be 4 or 5 hours a day of doing that. How productive is really that? Not really productive at all.
There's a big difference. And from a performance standpoint, I think I'm very similar to you. And I'll give you an example. In my world, I went out for lunch with a very successful businessman recently. And we're just talking about what I do. And he gave me a lovely compliment. He said, Daniel, I think you might be on the spectrum. And I said, what do you mean by that? He says, do you have Asperger's? I said, what do you mean? He said, you're obsessive. And what I had explained to him was all the things that I had done and can fit into my day. And for me, if I'm going to research a topic, I won't just read one paper or two papers. I might read 100. I won't read one book. I'll read everything I can find. And an example of that was I was learning how to think. And there's a very good author by the name of Dr. Edward de Bono. And he wrote 70 books. And I read all 70 books multiple times. And I was obsessed about it. And once I got that knowledge, I moved on to the next one. And I found the next author and I read all their 50 books.
Wow.
I'm obsessive. I'm compulsive. But there is performance in there. And with coaching, we're always educating people on the difference between activity and productivity. Because the gentleman here with who's constantly washing his hands, there's a lot of activity. You can't deny that he's not busy, but it's just not productive.
It's non-productive activity. That's the key difference here. And so you have a little bit more like what I have, but maybe on steroids a little bit, because you go down that rabbit hole with a subject and you go down that rabbit hole. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of self-taught people, that's how they get where they get is doesn't matter where they get an education on, they're going to get an education on their own. And in some ways they get a great education. So, it's productive and it's interesting to you and you have a mind for it. So, more power to it.
But it is an obsession. And I know sometimes I've got to say to myself, Daniel, it's time to stop. But it also is like a form of addiction for me. It's like, I'm getting so much pleasure from it. I'm getting so much joy from reading.
You're getting a little dopamine from it, and that's what makes it good for you. It's better than some other things, there are worse alternatives. So at least you're gaining knowledge and you're gaining understanding. So it's not all bad as long as you maintain some relationships in the meantime,
Well, it does. The cost is sometimes I will have more joy and satisfaction from books or studying than going out socially. Because many years ago, I worked in the airline industry and I'd travel around with 400 customers, 17 cabin crew, and would go out on layovers. And a lot of the conversation was just garbage and gossip. And I used to sit around and go, I don't want to hear about other people's sex lives. I don't want to hear about who's cheating on who. I'm not interested in what's in the tabloids. I'm not interested in conspiracy theories unless it's aliens. I'm not interested. And so I would go back to my room or I'd buy books on the layover. But I never felt lonely if I had a book. That was the fascinating thing. And I was learning, and that was addictive for me. But
and I can't fault that. I can't fault that. That's who you are, and you should embrace it rather than apologize for it. As long as you can maintain meaningful relationships in your life, you should embrace, who you are and not make apologies for it. You probably know a lot about a lot of things, and there's something to be said for that. I have a grandson like that. He's 9 years old, and he's completely, he's goes to school, but he reads at about a 12th grade level at 9 years old, and he's taught himself the Greek alphabet, the Russian alphabet, all these different alphabets on his own. He knows the universe, he knows the solar system, he knows quantum science, he knows chemistry. I don't know what he doesn't know. Geography, I mean, he knows more geography than I do, and I'm a geography buff, and he knows more than I do by a long shot. So, and he's all self-taught. He's got this brain that just needs it. So, and no one's pushing him, no one's getting him to do anything. But he's kind of a semi-quiet 9-year-old. You would never know until you have a conversation with him, and I don't even know where his knowledge ends. I have no idea. Um, and I embrace that. That's who he is, and he's happy, and that's what matters. And we let him be a kid. We don't try not to push him to do what he shouldn't be doing. And you're being who you are, right? And that's who you are. So that's okay.
Mm. Well, I realized at a young age that my brain worked differently to others. But unfortunately, I got a label. I was diagnosed as linear sequential learning disabled. And it definitely wasn't empowering because it was like, okay, well, here's a diagnosis. And in my opinion, in medicine, if there's an examination and a diagnosis, the third thing that follows is the prescription. But it was just examination, diagnosis, you're disabled, let's put you in a special room. And for me, it stuck because I love to learn. And what I've learned over the years that it's impossible not to learn. We absorb information visually, auditorily, from our environment, from other people. It's shared with us at a cellular level. But I was learning disabled. And I realized that I learned differently. And it wasn't a problem with me, it was a systemic problem. So as I got a little bit older, I took my own path where I didn't have to be tested. I even tried to go back to university. And the professor said, well, Daniel, you're doing really good, but you should go back to high school. And I said, I'm 27. I ain't going back to high school.
Yeah.
I said, this is a system problem. I said, if you just verbally ask me the questions or let me show you how to apply this in real life, I'll run rings around everybody else. But when it comes to doing your assessment here, your test, it's not how my brain brings out and retrieves the information. I said, that's my challenge, but it doesn't mean I don't have intelligence. And so even at 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, when I'm having to do all these exams, I'm struggling. But it was a systemic problem. But I did realize that through that experience, once I got to about 32, I met other people who had been studying how the mind works. And they said, Daniel, this is how you need to learn. And once they showed me how to learn, I could get back into the knowledge that I wanted to acquire and do it in a way that made me feel good. And there was a lot of stigma, and it felt like I couldn't change. But sometimes once you get a good diagnosis and you're working with a professional, they should be able to provide you a prescription and a way forward. And if it's transcranial magnetic stimulation and there's a solution, go for it. Do it because there's got to be a solution, but you've got to be working with a reputable person like yourself who's seen it and can be improved in many different ways. I think that's a key.
Yeah,
You
no,
mentioned
absolutely.
you mentioned transcranial magnetic stimulation. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is it, and what are the improvements that you're seeing in your patients?
Well, it's an acronym for Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. It was discovered in England and London in 1985, developed over several decades. In fact, one of the lead researchers is from Australia, and then there's other researchers all over the world. It focuses electromagnetic pulses on surface areas of the brain that have been discovered through a lot of research to be areas that are key to depression or OCD and even addiction. There's some sites that they've now found that might be helpful. And it can cross over the skull and stimulate the surface cells of the brain. And that's well proven. In fact, When you first start a patient on TMS, you get the right hand to twitch by going on the motor strip, so you can see it actually stimulating the neurons. That's how you determine the dose, and you also find the location. So it's very hard science. There's over 100,000 papers published worldwide related to TMS. So it's not hocus pocus. It's not a mystery. It's not experimental. We know more about TMS than we do how all the meds work. We know more about TMS than a lot of things. Even neurosurgeons are using TMS now. So it's really powerful. It also works through the principle of what we call neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability for the brain to make adaptations and changes that are anatomical. And so by stimulating a circuit in the brain, we actually make it slightly more anatomical and strong, actually more connections. So when it works, it has a more of a long-term effect. So you could have someone come out of depression. They may stay out of depression for years or indefinitely. That's the power of TMS. It also doesn't have any long-term side effects. It's the safest thing you can do. It's safer than meds. It's safer than ECT. It's safer than any other biological intervention. So it's really powerful. There's a psychiatrist in Tasmania that does it. I met him, and then in Australia they have it, but all over the world it exists. Um, it's it's become a worldwide phenomenon for sure.
I think it was hundreds of years ago that some surgeons were using magnets in operations to be able to reduce the blood flow. And so after they had done the operations, they would use their magnets to slow down the blood flow and to stimulate and heal a particular region of the body. And I had first heard about that when I was studying hypnosis, and they were talking about magnet therapy. I also had a lady who was on my podcast recently who calls herself the Magnet Lady, and she's in America. And she was talking about all the benefits that her clients were receiving through magnet therapy. I remember my grandfather, he must have had sore knees or maybe arthritis in his knees, and he used to have magnets on his knees. And he would swear by it. And it's non invasive, there's no needles, it's pain free.
Well, there's
What?
the science behind something like that. Now they'd have to prove, of course, through double-blind studies that those were truly effective. But
Mm,
in general, the brain is an electrochemical organ. It uses in part electrical pulses that go down the dendrite. It's called an action potential. But then at the end of the dendrite, there's bags of chemicals we call neurotransmitters that once the action potential reaches those storage areas of neurochemicals, they get released. They cross a little gap we call a synapse over to the cell body, and they create an action in the cell body. So there's the electrical part of it, and then there's the chemical part of it. So that's why we call it an electrochemical organ. So by using either electricity or electromagnetic pulses, we can actually stimulate neurons in targeted areas to be more active. So
mm,
there's a lot of science behind all of it. It's people kind of when they first heard about it, well, that can't be real. But there's way more science behind this than anything else that I do.
mm,
So it's and there's some lead scientists in the world that are really have great reputations.
mm.
So there's a lot behind it. And
Oh,
my book kind of goes over all these things. It talks about different types of treatment. It's just not just a narrow thing about drugs or meds. It's about
mm,
everything. Psychotherapy's in there, TMS, ECT, talks about ketamine and medications, talks about psychosocial interventions. It talks about everything because I want people to have a well-rounded concept of how people can get better. And
mm,
so I talk about all those things, but everything in there, even the psychotherapy, is more evidence-based. I don't just put in anything. Everything is evidence-based. We hear about a lot of things, mushrooms and microdosing and all these things, but they don't have yet the double-blind studies to support that they're necessarily the thing to go. Preliminary
mm,
research seems pretty exciting, but then there's all kinds of variables. So I don't put that in the book. I don't put things in there
mm,
that were still hypothetical. I put stuff in the book that we know,
mm.
so that way people can kind of trust it.
And I think, if we think like a builder has many tools in his toolbox. And with mental health conditions, we need many tools to be able to treat them because in my opinion, not one size fits all. And some people may or may not respond to a particular medication, but they may respond to magnets. They might respond to sound therapy. But we need options. We
Right.
need a lot
And I
of
agree with
options.
that. It's called informed consent. When I meet with somebody and they have a particular diagnosis, it's like, here's all the options for you. Here's the biological interventions. Here's the other options for you. And I give them numbers. Here's the statistics behind each one of these things. I basically force them to make their own decision. I'm not here to tell them what to do, but I'm also here to provide sound evidence-based information. And I give numbers, I give percentages. So they're smart people. They can make those decisions. They don't need me to do that for them. And so it's really important that I educate people. My book is kind of like one big informed consent. Like, here's what you can do for depression. Here's what you can do for bipolar. And there may not be every last detail of every med you could ever try, but it tells about the general options for each condition, and as well as psychotherapies that have been proven to be helpful. There's thousands and thousands of psychotherapies, and I can't go into every single one, or I have to go into the ones that have data behind them, research behind them, because that's what I can recommend. Everything else is like, well, it could be helpful. I don't know. And I don't really want to give that advice. I want to give the advice as we know these things can be helpful. So that's kind of how I approach things. It's really data based, and but it's not cold facts either. It's a human element, right? We're treating a human being, so we got to make sure they feel the sense that we care about what happens, we care about how their life turns out, and that's the ultimate, is how it turns out for them.
I once read an article in the Journal of American Medical Association, and they were saying that 60 to 70% of outpatient visits to the hospital were for stress, anxiety, and depression. And unfortunately, as an outpatient at a hospital, the hospital's not geared to support you. So around about 97% of people who were going for help didn't get the help they were looking for. And I had fitted that statistic perfectly because I had a turning point in my life. It was 2013. I had my wife had had an accident on an aircraft. She was suffering from PTSD for about 2.5 years. She had 3 major knee surgeries, and I had to go on that journey with her. And eventually, I ended my career because I had to make a choice. Do I work and miss the birth of my daughter, or do I resign and be there for the birth of my daughter? So I resigned, but once you resign from your job, you got to start a business or you got to do something else for income. And for the first year, I really struggled, and it was a lot of pressure. I've resigned from my career. I've moved country. My wife's been suffering from PTSD. I'm a new father. I can't get this business working. And for me, the pressure showed up in breathing problems. And it was like I could never get a full breath of air into my lungs. And even if I got a little bit in here, it never went all the way down. So I said to my wife once, I said, I think I better go to the hospital. I can't breathe. So I went to the hospital. They did x-rays. I saw the doctor and he said, Mr. Tolson, there's nothing wrong with you. He said, it's all in your head. I said, okay. So what does that mean? He said, let me give you a referral. And so they sent me to a psychiatrist and I sat down, had a conversation. I went through what I was going through. And he said, Mr. Tolson, it's clear that you're depressed. And I said, okay, what's the way forward? He said, well, let me recommend some medication. So I took the medication and it did give me some temporary relief. And I used it for as long as I needed to. And I said, okay, that's given me a start, but I got to make sure the other areas of my life are working. And I even had to change environment. I had to move to a new country because the country that I was living in couldn't support me financially at that stage. So there was the medication that gave me a boost. A change in direction gave me another boost. But it wasn't just start and forget. I had to keep working on the mindset. So there was many things that I did to help me get out of that low spot. And the medication was definitely a start. It was a turning point. It gave me some temporary relief. It enabled me to breathe a little bit better. And then took me a little bit of time. Maybe it was 6 or 8 months. but I got out of that loop until the next crisis came.
Well, you illustrate a good point there. When I was trained in the 1980s, I was told that 50% of people with depression will present to a family doctor or a non-psychiatrist with physical complaints, when in actuality they have depression. That's what happened with you. So fortunately, you got a good referral, you got it treated, you made lifestyle changes that were contributing to your downward spiral, so to speak. A lot of pressure on you, financial issues, uncertainty. So you did all the right things. You followed your doctor's advice. You got on some meds that helped kind of turn it around, but that wasn't the whole answer. So that's a really good illustration of kind of how it should be. And you were, strong enough, I guess, to accept help, get help, need help. You did it for you. You did it for your family, right? Because you had to be there for them. So that's a great illustration right there of how it can be. But that's pretty common, actually, because physical complaints are often 50% of the presentation.
I think my biggest learning was being a high performance person. I set a lot of goals. So I was grieving the loss of the lifestyle that I had. So I was co-leading a team of 17,500 cabin crew. Every day I'd be given 17 new cabin crew, 400 customers, and a $500 million aircraft to take from one side of the world to the other. It was a wonderful responsibility, but it came to an end. My life that I had living in Dubai came to an end. My role in peer support and critical incident stress management came to an end. So I was grieving the sudden loss of that. But what I figured out later on was I was also grieving the future that I had planned. I felt depressed because I had so many aims and goals and objectives that I wanted to achieve through that career and the place that I was living. And I noticed that I was grieving the loss of my future as well, which was an interesting concept because with goal setting, what we do is we go out into the future, a year or 5 or 10 years from now, and we start to say, this is who I want to be. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to have. And we assume that that path we're on is going to get us there. And so we start to acquire new knowledge, new skills, we develop attitudes. But we come to a crisis point, and the life that we've lived for me had ended, but also that direction no longer existed because it was dependent on where I was. And so it took a long time to course correct, to find a new direction. And once I changed the direction, I had new hopes and wishes and ambitions. My mood significantly lifted, but I had to be able to let go of the past and still change my direction. And once I had done that in combination of many other things, group therapy, personal coaching, I definitely got back on a very different horse. It wasn't the same horse. It was a very different horse. And it took me to a new destination.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the book, I talk about people resetting after they've developed a mental illness, and it will change their expectations, change where they want to go, and that's okay. Because we get ourselves so set on something that when it doesn't happen, it's a major psychological loss. And so there's always a silver lining. Life, I tell people, isn't a straight line. It's a journey. And usually it's a tough journey. You're going through potholes and canyons and crossing mountains and, dealing with weather and storms and losses. And, that's how life really is. Life isn't a straight line and it's straight down the yellow brick road to happiness. It's really much different than that. And you're a great example of landing on your feet and accepting help and pivoting and going through a tough journey, basically, going through the refiner's fire. But I bet you're a better human being as a result. Bet you're more empathetic as a result. Understand other people going through difficult life situations as a result of all that. And thus you're on a show like this where you can talk to other humans and kind of explore the human condition, right? And how we all navigate it.
I learned about object fixation. And I think there's some things that we're absolutely fixated on. And In goal setting, we say stubbornly focus on what you want to the exclusion of everything else. And the problem with that is that sometimes we forget to look at the reality of the situation. Okay, this is my goal. It's not happening, but I stubbornly refuse to look at anything else and accept any external feedback. And object fixation happens to people who set goals, but it also happens to skydivers and base jumpers. And what happens is for a skydiver, they jump out of the back of the aircraft, or for the base jumper, they jump off the side of the building. And they're so focused on where they're going to land that they forget to pull their parachute. And they plummet to the earth and splat on the ground because they're so fixated on that one thing, but they're not taking in the feedback that's being presented. And I think for us to be able to course correct, yes, we've got to be able to focus on what we want, but we also need to be open to other information. And if the information is it's not working the way that it was intended to, that's also okay. You've got to look around and not put yourself in danger, but update your destination based on the new information and course correct. And I think if we have the willingness to do that, and if we realize that one of the internal constraints to success could be a mental health issue, and we seek help, we'll definitely get to the destination without the self-harm or the hurt and the disappointment. I think we can do a better job of that.
It's a shortcut to being happier sooner. You don't want to on purpose go through terrible things if you can help it, because terrible things are going to happen anyway. So the more we can take a shortcut and bypass some of that stuff, the better. And sometimes we just can't avoid it, right? Loss and things happen and jobs. And, you could be down a career path you think is rock solid. Like in today's world, who knows what that is? Think of all the auto workers who automation and factory automation, they lost their jobs and they're never going to come back. So they had their whole career set on that goal, just like you had yours on sights on one thing. But that's not how it works, because nothing is necessarily that solid. Even today, software engineer, you got a career, you're set. Well, not anymore. A lot of software engineers are losing their job. So it's just, there's always uncertainty. You have to kind of think of it as the big universe, and sometimes it has something else in store for us. So, but we got to get the mental illness part out of the way, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. So it's just a big handicap. So we get that out of the way, then the rest is up to us to figure out and sort out. Surround ourselves with good people, surround people who care about us, who support us. That just makes it so much easier.
And the right information. Got to get the
right
right
information.
information.
There's plenty of
Which
wrong
brings
information
us-
out there, trust me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So how do we get a copy of the book? Why Me? The Brain on Tilt. Where can we get a copy from today?
Well, it's on Amazon, and it's around the world, and mainly English-speaking areas, because I don't have any translations. So it's on Amazon. If you go to my website, which is davidkentauthor.com, then you go there and you can see stuff about me. You can see stuff about the book. There's a link on there, the direct link to the Amazon site. There's 3 versions. There's paperback, Kindle, and now I have an audio version. The audio version is really awesome. So you can do that. And also on my website, I'm posting these podcasts as they come along, so you can start to see the different podcasts I have. And I've got a lot of upcoming things, and I go to different conferences and things. So you can kind of see what I'm up to. There's an email at the very bottom. If you had a question or you just weren't sure about something, you could send me an email. So that's a good spot to start. But Amazon, Why Me, The Brain on Tilt, Dr. David Kent, that's the best. When in doubt, just do that. But I think it's a worthwhile read, and I would recommend you read it. I think you'll get a lot out of it, especially all the ferocious reading you do. I think you'll really enjoy it. I think you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. And it only reads in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's not a long read. It's pretty condensed.
Dr. David Kent, thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.